Julian Cross was Seattle's most successful CEO and its loneliest man, until he found a 7-year-old girl dying at a bus stop, abandoned by a mother who disappeared into Seattle's drug underworld. Sophie was hypothermic, malnourished, and had been waiting 6 hours for someone who would never come home. Julian had lost his own daughter 3 years earlier and thought his heart was permanently broken. But when Sophie whispered, "Don't let me die alone," everything changed. Saving her life was the easy part. Fighting a legal system determined to return her to the woman who'd left her to freeze would test whether love really could conquer everything, or whether some fights were impossible to win. The November rain fell in sheets across downtown Seattle, turning the evening rush hour into a blur of headlights and hurried pedestrians seeking shelter. Julian Cross stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd-floor office, watching the city blur through the water streaming down the glass, feeling as disconnected from the bustling life below as if he were observing from another planet. At 38, Julian had everything the business world insisted mattered. A tech empire worth $800 million, a penthouse that graced architectural magazines, and the kind of success that made him a fixture on Forbes lists. But success, he'd learned, was a poor substitute for the family he'd lost 3 years ago in a car accident that had taken his wife and 6-year-old daughter and left him hollowed out inside. "Mr. Cross." His assistant's voice came through the intercom, pulling him from thoughts that always led to the same dark places. "The Tokyo call has been moved to 9 a.m. tomorrow. Should I reschedule your dinner with the Morrison Group?" "Cancel it," Julian said, his voice carrying the flat tone that had become his default since learning that grief was a permanent resident, not a temporary visitor. "I'll work late tonight." Work was safer than going home to an empty penthouse that still echoed with phantom laughter from a little girl who would never again ask him to read bedtime stories or help with homework that challenged her brilliant 7-year-old mind. At 8:30 p.m., Julian finally gathered his things and headed for the elevator, his reflection in the polished steel doors showing a man who looked successful and felt empty. His driver was waiting in the garage, but Julian dismissed him with a wave. Sometimes the illusion of normalcy required pretending he was just another commuter heading home instead of a widower avoiding the silence that waited there. The bus stop on Pine Street was nearly deserted when Julian passed it, most evening commuters having long since reached their destinations. But something made him slow his steps, some instinct honed by 3 years of observing the world with the detached interest of someone who no longer felt part of it. A small figure huddled against the bus stop shelter, barely visible in the shadows cast by the streetlights. At first, Julian thought it was a discarded bag or pile of clothes, but as he moved closer, he could see the shape was too small, too still, too human. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles around a face that was pale with exhaustion and streaked with tears she'd probably been too tired to wipe away. She wore a thin jacket that provided no protection against the Seattle winter, jeans with holes in the knees that spoke of poverty rather than fashion, and sneakers that had seen better decades. But it was her stillness that alarmed Julian most. She wasn't moving, wasn't shivering despite the cold, wasn't showing any of the restless energy that should have characterized a child her age. "Hey," Julian said softly, crouching down to her level, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The little girl's eyes fluttered open, dark brown eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, the kind of wariness that came from learning early that adults couldn't be trusted to keep you safe. "I'm waiting for the bus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against concrete. Julian looked at the bus schedule posted behind her. The last bus on this route had left 20 minutes ago, and there wouldn't be another until morning. "What's your name?" Julian asked gently, noting how the child's lips had a bluish tinge that suggested hypothermia setting in. "Sophie," she said, and then, as if remembering something an adult had drilled into her, "Sophie Martinez. I'm 7 years old, and I live at 247 Pine Street, apartment 3B. The address she recited was 6 blocks away, in a neighborhood Julian knew was rough even by downtown standards. But more concerning was the way she delivered the information, like a mantra she'd been taught to repeat in case of emergency. "Sophie, I'm Julian," he said, shrugging out of his expensive overcoat and wrapping it around her small frame. "You're very cold, sweetheart. How long have you been sitting here?" Sophie pulled his coat closer, and Julian felt something crack in his chest at how the garment completely dwarfed her tiny frame. "Since the school bus dropped me off," she said matter-of-factly. "But Mama wasn't home, and I don't have a key, so I came here to wait for her." Julian checked his watch. School had ended nearly 6 hours ago. This little girl had been sitting alone in the cold for the entire evening, waiting for a mother who apparently wasn't coming home. "Sophie, do you have anyone else I can call? A daddy or grandparents, or someone who takes care of you?" Sophie shook her head, and Julian saw her lower lip tremble before she bit it to stop the motion. A gesture that reminded him painfully of his own daughter's habit of trying to be brave when she was scared. "It's just me and Mama," Sophie said. "But sometimes she has to work late, and sometimes she forgets to come home. But she always comes back eventually." The casual way Sophie delivered this information, the acceptance of abandonment as normal, the resignation in her voice when she talked about being forgotten, made Julian's heart clench with recognition. This was a child who'd learned to expect disappointment, who'd been failed by the people who should have protected her. "Sophie," Julian said carefully, "you can't sit here all night. It's too cold, and it's not safe. Will you let me help you?" Sophie studied his face with the serious consideration of someone who'd learned to read adult intentions for signs of danger. "Are you a good person?" she asked finally. The question hit Julian like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked him that? When was the last time he'd considered whether success and goodness were the same thing? "I'm trying to be," Julian said honestly. "I have a warm car, and I know a place where we can get you some hot food while we figure out how to find your mama. Would that be okay?" Sophie nodded slowly, and when Julian helped her stand, he felt how light she was. Too light for a 7-year-old. The kind of thinness that suggested meals were irregular and insufficient. As Julian guided Sophie toward his car, she slipped her small hand into his much larger one with the trust of a child who'd run out of other options. The gesture sent shockwaves through Julian's carefully constructed emotional walls, reminding him of another small hand that used to seek his comfort. Another little girl who'd believed he could fix anything. "Mr. Julian?" Sophie said as he helped her into the passenger seat, her voice small in the luxury of his sedan. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for finding me. I was getting really scared." Julian looked down at the small person who'd somehow managed to stay hopeful despite being abandoned, who'd thanked him for basic human decency, who'd reminded him what it felt like to be needed by someone innocent and trusting. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he heard himself saying, words that felt foreign after 3 years of emotional numbness. "I'm going to make sure you're safe." As Julian drove through the rainy Seattle streets with Sophie falling asleep in the seat beside him, he had no idea that he'd just made a promise that would change both their lives forever. He didn't know that this little girl would teach him how to love again, or that saving her would ultimately save him from the grief that had been slowly killing him one empty day at a time. But for the first time in 3 years, Julian Cross felt something besides numbness in his chest: purpose, protectiveness. The beginning of hope that maybe his heart wasn't as broken as he'd believed. Have you ever felt completely alone even when surrounded by success? What would you do if you found a child who needed help and had nowhere else to turn? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe because Julian and Sophie are about to discover that sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. The pediatric emergency room at Seattle Children's Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos, but Julian's world had narrowed to the small examination room where Sophie lay on a gurney that made her look even tinier than she was. Dr. Patricia Wells, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too many children in Sophie's condition, finished her examination with gentle efficiency. "She's severely dehydrated and malnourished," Dr. Wells explained quietly, her voice pitched so Sophie couldn't hear from where she was dozing under heated blankets. "When did you say you found her?" "About 2 hours ago," Julian replied, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched Sophie's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep. "She said she'd been waiting at the bus stop since school ended. 6 hours in near-freezing rain," Dr. Wells said, making notes on her tablet. She's lucky you found her when you did. Another hour or two, and we'd be looking at serious hypothermia. Julian felt something dark and protective unfurling in his chest. What about her mother? Have you been able to reach her? Dr. Wells's expression grew carefully neutral. Social services is handling that. There's no answer at the address Sophie gave, and the neighbors say they haven't seen Maria Martinez in 3 days. 3 days. Julian's voice carried an edge that made Dr. Wells look up sharply. She left a 7-year-old alone for 3 days? Mr. Cross, Dr. Wells said gently, I understand you're concerned, but there are protocols we have to follow. Social services will investigate, and if necessary, Sophie will be placed in temporary foster care until... No. The word came out sharper than Julian intended, surprising both the doctor and himself with its intensity. I mean, is there another option? Someone who could care for her temporarily while you locate her mother? Dr. Wells studied Julian carefully. Are you a relative? A family friend? Julian looked through the window at Sophie, who was stirring restlessly in her sleep. Her small face creased with worry even in unconsciousness. I'm someone who doesn't want to see her bounced between strangers when she's already been through enough, Julian said quietly. I have resources, Dr. Wells. I can provide whatever she needs while you search for her mother. Mr. Cross, I appreciate your concern, but taking responsibility for a child you've just met is a significant commitment. Foster care exists for situations like this. Foster care exists because sometimes there's no other option, Julian interrupted. But there is another option. Me. Dr. Wells looked at Julian, really looked at him, taking in the expensive suit that couldn't hide the genuine concern in his eyes, the way he'd positioned himself protectively near Sophie's bedside, the careful way he'd handled every interaction with the frightened little girl. What do you do for a living, Mr. Cross? I'm CEO of Cross Technologies, Julian said, then added more quietly, and I had a daughter once. I know how to take care of a 7-year-old. Something in his voice made Dr. Wells pause her questioning. Had. She died 3 years ago, Julian said simply.
Car accident.
She was 6. The admission hung in the air between them, explaining the fierce protectiveness Julian felt toward Sophie, the way his entire demeanor had changed from successful businessman to worried parent. Mr. Cross, Dr. Wells said gently, I need to ask, are you sure this is about helping Sophie and not about trying to replace someone you lost? Julian considered the question seriously, looking at Sophie's sleeping face and feeling the familiar ache of missing Emma. His own daughter who'd had the same dark hair and serious expression when she was thinking hard about something. Maybe it started that way, he admitted. But Sophie isn't Emma. She's her own person, with her own needs, her own story. And right now, her story is that she's alone and scared. And I'm someone who can make sure she's not alone anymore. Dr. Wells made a decision that would change 3 lives. I'll speak with social services about emergency placement. If they approve a background check and home evaluation, you could serve as Sophie's temporary guardian while we search for her mother. November 18th, Cross Penthouse, Seattle. 3 days later, Julian found himself standing in the children's section of Nordstrom with Sophie, feeling more overwhelmed than he had during any corporate merger. The little girl stood beside him, still too thin but looking healthier after 3 days of regular meals and medical care, studying the array of clothing options with the serious concentration of someone making important decisions. I don't need much, Sophie said quietly, her small hand touching a simple blue sweater, just something warm. Julian's heart clenched at her careful consideration of cost, her automatic impulse to minimize her own needs. Sophie, he said, crouching down to her eye level, you can have whatever you like, and you need more than just one warm thing. You need clothes for school and pajamas, and a warm coat for when we go outside. Sophie looked at him with the wariness of a child who'd learned that generosity often came with strings attached. But what if Mama comes back and she's mad that I got new clothes? What if she thinks I'm being greedy? The question revealed so much about Sophie's world. A place where a child's basic needs were treated as luxuries, where wanting things was dangerous, where love was conditional on not asking for too much. "Your mama won't be mad," Julian said gently. "Mamas want their little girls to have warm clothes and everything they need. And if she is upset, that's between her and me, not you. Your job is just to be 7 years old." As they shopped, Julian began to see glimpses of the child Sophie could be when she wasn't worried about survival. She had opinions about colors. Purple was her favorite. Preferences about styles. She liked dresses that twirled. And a shy smile that transformed her entire face when she found something that made her happy. "Mr. Julian?" Sophie said as they sat in the store cafe sharing a grilled cheese sandwich that she was eating with careful, deliberate bites. "Why are you helping me?" Julian considered how to explain complicated adult emotions to a 7-year-old who'd already seen too much of the world's harsh realities. "Because everyone deserves to have someone who cares about them," he said finally. "And because helping you makes me remember what it feels like to do something important." "More important than your job?" Julian looked at this little girl who asked profound questions with innocent curiosity and felt something shift in his chest. "Much more important than my job," he said, meaning it completely. November 25th, Thanksgiving Day. Julian had never celebrated Thanksgiving as a single person. For the past 3 years, he'd worked through the holiday, treating it like any other Thursday. But with Sophie in his home, ignoring the day felt wrong. "Have you ever had Thanksgiving dinner?" Julian asked as they stood in his kitchen, which had been professionally designed but rarely used for actual cooking. "Mama and I had McDonald's once on Thanksgiving," Sophie said, perched on a kitchen stool and swinging her legs. "But mostly she had to work, so I just watched the parade on TV." Julian felt the familiar surge of anger toward Maria Martinez, followed immediately by sadness for all the holidays Sophie had spent alone. "Well, this year we're going to have a real Thanksgiving," Julian declared, pulling out his phone to research how to cook a turkey. "With all the traditional food and everything." What followed was a comedy of errors that had Sophie giggling. Julian burning the rolls, nearly dropping the turkey, and discovering that mashed potatoes were more complicated than they looked. But as they sat at his dining room table that evening, sharing a meal that was imperfect but made with love, Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Gratitude. "Mr. Julian," Sophie said, her voice serious as she looked at the feast spread before them, "is this what families do?" "Yes, sweetheart," Julian said, his throat tight with emotion. "This is exactly what families do." That night, as Julian tucked Sophie into the guest room he'd converted into a little girl's bedroom, complete with the purple comforter she'd chosen and a bookshelf filled with stories, she looked up at him with trust shining in her dark eyes. "Will you read me a story?" she asked. Julian hadn't read a bedtime story in 3 years, hadn't been able to bear the memories it would trigger. But looking at Sophie, he realized that some pain was worth enduring if it brought comfort to someone else. As he read about princesses and adventures, Julian felt his broken heart beginning to remember how to love. Not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as something new and precious in its own right. Sophie fell asleep holding his hand, and Julian sat in the quiet darkness of her room, understanding for the first time that healing didn't mean forgetting Emma. It meant opening his heart wide enough to love again. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning while Julian was making Sophie's breakfast, humming along to her chatter about the Christmas play her new school was preparing. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the early hour made Julian answer with a sense of foreboding. "Mr. Cross? This is Detective Ray Morrison with Seattle PD. We need to discuss Sophie Martinez." Julian felt ice forming in his stomach as he watched Sophie carefully arranging her cereal into patterns, blissfully unaware that her fragile new world might be about to collapse. "What about Sophie?" Julian asked, moving into his home office where she couldn't overhear. "We found her mother, Maria Martinez. She's been arrested on drug trafficking charges, and she's claiming that you kidnapped her daughter." The words hit Julian like physical blows. "That's impossible. Social services placed Sophie with me as her temporary guardian. I have all the paperwork." "I understand that, sir. But Maria Martinez is claiming she never abandoned Sophie, that you coerced her daughter into leaving with you. She's demanding Sophie's immediate return and threatening to press charges if we don't comply. Julian sank into his desk chair, watching through the doorway as Sophie ate her breakfast in the sunny kitchen, where she'd been learning to feel safe for the first time in her life. Detective Morrison. Sophie was collapsed at a bus stop in hypothermic conditions. She'd been waiting there for 6 hours because her mother wasn't home. The hospital has medical records documenting her condition. We have that information, Mr. Cross, but we also have a mother claiming her parental rights are being violated. This situation is about to become very complicated. December 5th, Family Court, Seattle. The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken dreams, and Julian had never felt more out of place despite having faced hostile corporate boards and million-dollar negotiations. Across the aisle sat Maria Martinez, a woman in her late 20s with Sophie's dark hair and eyes, but hardened by whatever circumstances had led to her arrest. Her court-appointed attorney whispered urgently in her ear while she stared at Julian with undisguised hostility. Julian's attorney, Catherine Walsh, was one of Seattle's best family lawyers, but even she looked concerned as she reviewed the custody documents that had been filed overnight. "This is going to be difficult," Catherine warned quietly. "Parental rights are incredibly strong, even when the parent has been absent." Maria Martinez has a compelling story. Single mother struggling with addiction, trying to get clean, claiming her daughter was taken advantage of during a vulnerable moment. "What about Sophie's well-being?" Julian asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What about the fact that she was abandoned, malnourished, and nearly died from exposure?" "That's what we'll argue," Catherine replied. "But Julian, you need to prepare yourself. The court may decide that Sophie belongs with her biological mother, regardless of the circumstances." When the hearing began, Julian felt like he was watching his worst nightmare unfold in slow motion. Maria Martinez took the stand and painted herself as a devoted mother who'd been unfairly separated from her child by a wealthy man taking advantage of a temporary crisis. "I had the flu," Maria testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I was so sick I couldn't get out of bed. When I recovered and went to pick up Sophie from school, they told me some stranger had taken her. I've been searching for my daughter for weeks." The lie was so smooth, so convincing, that Julian almost believed it himself. But then he remembered Sophie's careful way of rationing food, her automatic assumption that asking for things was dangerous, her matter-of-fact acceptance of being abandoned. "Ms. Martinez," Catherine cross-examined, "if you were sick, why didn't you arrange for someone to pick up Sophie from school? Why didn't you call the school to explain your absence?" Maria's composure cracked slightly. I was too sick to think clearly, and I don't have family in Seattle. Sophie and we just have each other. Yet police records show you were arrested on December 1st at a location 30 miles outside the city," Catherine continued. "Can you explain what you were doing there if you were searching for your daughter?" "I was trying to make money to support her," Maria replied defiantly. "A mother does what she has to do." Julian watched this performance and felt sick. Maria Martinez was playing the role of devoted mother with the skill of someone who'd learned to manipulate systems, to present herself as a victim when accountability threatened. When Julian took the stand, he tried to explain what he'd witnessed. Sophie's condition when he found her, her obvious signs of chronic neglect, the way she'd blossomed with proper care. But under cross-examination from Maria's attorney, his motivations were painted in a different light. "Mr. Cross, you lost your own daughter 3 years ago, didn't you?" the attorney asked. "Yes," Julian replied carefully. "And you've been living alone since then, dealing with that grief?" "I've been managing by working excessive hours, avoiding social connections, essentially isolating yourself from normal human relationships." Julian saw where this was heading but couldn't avoid the trap. "I suppose that's accurate. So when you found Sophie, a little girl approximately the same age your daughter was when she died, you saw an opportunity to fill that void in your life?" "I saw a child who needed help," Julian said firmly. "A child you immediately took to your home, bought clothes for, enrolled in an expensive private school, essentially began treating as your own daughter?" I provided her with care and stability. Care and stability that allowed you to play father again, to experience the family life you'd lost? Catherine objected, but the damage was done. Julian could see the judge's expression shifting, doubt creeping in about his motives. December 15th, Cross Penthouse. The court had ordered a temporary halt to proceedings while a child psychologist evaluated Sophie's preferences and well-being. For 10 days, Julian lived in constant fear that each moment with Sophie might be their last together. "Mr. Julian," Sophie said one evening as they decorated the Christmas tree he'd bought for their living room, "are you going to send me back to Mama?" Julian's hands stilled on the ornament he was hanging, a silver angel that reminded him too much of the Christmas decorations Emma had loved. "Sophie, that's not my decision to make," he said carefully. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, these weeks we've had together have been some of the best of my life." Sophie climbed down from the step stool she'd been using to reach the higher branches and wrapped her arms around Julian's waist with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned to hold tight to good things because they often disappeared. "I don't want to go back," she whispered against his shirt. "Mama gets scary when she's sick, and I have to take care of myself. But with you, I get to be a kid." Julian knelt down to Sophie's level, looking into eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Sophie, I need you to tell me the truth about something very important. When the nice lady comes to talk to you tomorrow, she's going to ask you questions about where you want to live. You have to tell her exactly how you feel, even if you think it might hurt someone's feelings. Will you be in trouble if I say I want to stay with you?" Julian felt his heart breaking for this little girl who was more worried about protecting him than about her own future. "I might be," he said honestly. "But your job isn't to protect me, sweetheart. Your job is to tell the truth about what makes you feel safe and happy." That night, Julian lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that tomorrow's evaluation could determine whether Sophie returned to a life of neglect and fear, or stayed with him to build the family they'd both desperately needed. He'd built a billion-dollar empire by anticipating obstacles and outmaneuvering opponents. But this wasn't a business negotiation where money and influence could guarantee victory. This was about love, and the terrifying reality that sometimes love wasn't enough to protect the people who mattered most. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, no relation to Maria, was a child psychologist with 25 years of experience reading between the lines of what children said and what they really meant. She arrived at Julian's penthouse on a gray December morning, carrying the kind of professional warmth that put nervous children at ease while maintaining the objectivity courts required. "Sophie," Dr. Martinez said as they settled in the living room where the Christmas tree twinkled with lights Sophie had insisted on arranging herself, "I'm here to talk with you about some important things. There are no wrong answers, and you won't get in trouble for anything you tell me." Sophie sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her, wearing the purple dress Julian had bought her and holding the stuffed elephant that had become her constant companion since moving in with him. Julian watched from the kitchen doorway, close enough to provide comfort but far enough away to let Sophie speak freely. "Do you know why I'm here?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Because Mama wants me to come back, and Mr. Julian wants me to stay, and the judge has to decide what's best for me." "That's right. And what do you think would be best for you?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers stroking the elephant's soft ears, as she considered the question that would determine her future. "When I lived with Mama," Sophie said slowly, "I was always worried. Worried about if there would be food, worried about if she would come home, worried about if she would be happy or scary when she got there." Dr. Martinez made careful notes, her expression neutral but attentive. "Can you tell me more about feeling worried?" "Sometimes Mama would be gone for a long time," Sophie continued, her voice matter-of-fact in the way children spoke about traumatic things when they'd accepted them as normal. "And I would get really hungry, but there wasn't any food, so I learned to not eat very much so it would last longer." Julian gripped the doorframe, feeling rage and heartbreak war in his chest as Sophie described a childhood spent in survival mode. "And sometimes Mama would bring friends over, and they would be loud and scary, and I would hide in my room until they left. But sometimes they didn't leave for a really long time." "What about when your Mama was home and it was just the two of you?" Dr. Martinez asked. Sophie's face brightened slightly. Those were good days. Mama would hug me and tell me she loved me and promise we would do fun things together. But then she would get sad again and say she had to go help people. But really she was getting the medicine that made her sleepy and scary. Dr. Martinez looked up from her notes. Medicine. The medicine in the little bags that made her eyes funny and made her forget about me. Sophie explained with the clarity of a child who'd learned to decode adult behavior for survival purposes. After she took the medicine, she would either sleep for a really long time or get angry about everything. And how do you feel when you're here with Mr. Julian? Sophie's entire demeanor transformed, her small face lighting up with genuine joy. Safe, she said immediately. And like I can just be a kid. Mr. Julian makes sure there's always food, and he reads me stories, and he helps me with homework, and he never yells or brings scary people over. Do you miss your mama? Sophie considered this carefully. I miss the mama who hugged me and said she loved me, but I don't miss being scared all the time. Mr. Julian says loving someone means wanting them to be happy and safe, and I'm happy and safe here. December 28th, Family Court. The courtroom was packed for the custody hearing that had attracted media attention due to Julian's high profile and the unusual circumstances of the case. Julian sat with Catherine, feeling the weight of every gaze as reporters, social workers, and curious observers filled the gallery. Maria Martinez looked different from her first court appearance. Cleaner, more put together, playing the role of reformed mother with calculated precision. Her new attorney, funded by a victims' rights organization that had taken up her cause, painted Julian as a wealthy predator who'd exploited a vulnerable family. Your Honor, Maria's attorney argued, Mr. Cross may have provided material comfort for Sophie, but he cannot replace the irreplaceable bond between a mother and child. Ms. Martinez has completed a rehabilitation program and is ready to resume her parental responsibilities. But when Dr. Martinez took the stand to present her evaluation, the courtroom grew silent. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martinez testified, Sophie Martinez exhibits classic signs of chronic stress and hypervigilance that are consistent with long-term neglect and emotional trauma. However, in the past 6 weeks, she has shown remarkable improvement in all areas of development. Can you elaborate on that improvement? Catherine asked. Sophie has gained 12 pounds, bringing her weight into the normal range for her age. Her academic performance has improved dramatically. Most significantly, she demonstrates age-appropriate emotional responses and has begun exhibiting the kind of carefree behavior typical of securely attached children. And in your professional opinion, what would be in Sophie's best interest going forward? Dr. Martinez looked directly at the judge. Sophie has formed a secure attachment with Mr. Cross. Removing her from his care at this point would constitute another traumatic abandonment and could undo months of healing. In my opinion, the stability and emotional security she has found with Mr. Cross is essential for her continued development. Maria's attorney tried to discredit the evaluation, arguing that 6 weeks wasn't enough time to assess long-term well-being, but the damage was done. Then Catherine called her surprise witness. The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. Julian looked confused as an elderly woman in her 70s walked to the witness stand with the dignity of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Mrs. Hartwell, Catherine began, can you tell us your relationship to this case? I live in the apartment below Maria Martinez and Sophie, Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed too much to stay silent. I've been watching this situation for over a year. What have you observed? Mrs. Hartwell looked directly at Maria, her expression stern but not unkind. That little girl raised herself. I heard her crying at night when her mother didn't come home. I saw her digging through dumpsters looking for food. I called Child Protective Services 6 times in the past year because of the noise, the strangers coming and going at all hours, the smell of drugs coming from that apartment. The courtroom erupted in whispers that the judge quickly silenced. I tried to help when I could, Mrs. Hartwell continued. I'd leave food outside their door, invite Sophie to watch TV with me when the noise upstairs got too scary. But that child learned to take care of herself because she had to. Have you seen Sophie since she's been living with Mr. Cross? Yes. He brought her by to get some of her belongings, and I barely recognized her. She looked like a child instead of a little adult. She was laughing, holding his hand, talking about school and friends and all the things a 7-year-old should be excited about. Mrs. Hartwell turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, I've raised 5 children and I've seen what good parenting looks like. That man loves that little girl the way she deserves to be loved. Maria may be her biological mother, but Mr. Cross is her father in every way that matters. January 15th. The verdict. Judge Robert Harrison had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing testimony, psychological evaluations, and the mountain of evidence presented by both sides. When court reconvened for his decision, the tension was palpable. This case, Judge Harrison began, represents one of the most difficult decisions I've faced in 20 years on the bench. On one hand, we have the fundamental right of a parent to raise their biological child. On the other hand, we have compelling evidence that the child's welfare may be better served in a different environment. Julian felt Sophie's small hand slip into his. She'd been allowed to attend this final hearing at Dr. Martinez's recommendation. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Judge Harrison continued, I find that while Ms. Martinez clearly loves her daughter, love alone is not sufficient to overcome the pattern of neglect and instability that has characterized Sophie's life. Maria's face crumpled, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Therefore, this court awards permanent custody of Sophie Martinez to Julian Cross, with supervised visitation rights for the biological mother contingent upon her continued sobriety and completion of parenting classes. The courtroom exploded in reactions. Supporters cheering, reporters rushing for their phones, Maria sobbing into her attorney's shoulder. But Julian only had eyes for Sophie, who looked up at him with wonder and joy. Does this mean I get to stay with you forever? She whispered. Forever and always, Julian promised, scooping her into his arms as tears of relief and gratitude streamed down his face. Outside the courthouse, as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, Julian carried Sophie to their car while she waved shyly at the crowd. Mr. Julian, she said as they drove home through the Seattle traffic. Can I call you Daddy now? Julian had to pull over because his vision blurred with tears at the word he'd thought he'd never hear again. I would be honored, he managed to say, if you called me Daddy. And in that moment, Julian Cross understood that he hadn't just saved Sophie. She had saved him too, teaching him that the heart's capacity for love was infinite, and that family was defined not by blood but by choice, commitment, and the daily decision to put someone else's well-being above your own. The first morning after the custody ruling, Julian woke to the sound of singing coming from the kitchen. A clear, sweet voice belting out a song Sophie had learned in her school's music class. He found her standing on a step stool at the counter, carefully measuring ingredients for pancakes with the focused concentration of someone taking on an important responsibility. Good morning, Daddy, she said without looking up from the mixing bowl, and Julian felt his heart skip at how naturally the word rolled off her tongue, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to say it. Good morning, sweetheart, Julian replied, moving to stand beside her. What's all this? I'm making us celebration breakfast, Sophie announced proudly, because yesterday was the best day of my whole life, and Mrs. Eleanor said that special days deserve special food. Julian watched his daughter, carefully pour batter onto the griddle with the tip of her tongue poking out in concentration, and felt overwhelmed by the simple joy of this domestic moment. Sophie, he said gently, you know you don't have to take care of me, right? That's my job now, taking care of you. Sophie looked up at him with wisdom beyond her 7 years. I know, Daddy, but families take care of each other. That's what makes them families. As they sat at the breakfast table sharing slightly lumpy but perfectly delicious pancakes, Julian realized that Sophie was teaching him as much about love as he was teaching her about security. March 20th, 2025, Cross Technologies headquarters. Julian's assistant knocked on his office door at exactly 3:30 p.m., just as he was finishing a conference call with investors in Tokyo. But instead of entering with the usual stack of documents requiring his attention, She stepped aside to reveal Sophie, still in her school uniform and carrying a backpack nearly as big as she was. "Daddy!" Sophie called out, running across the office to throw herself into his arms with the abandon of someone completely secure in their welcome. "Hey, princess," Julian said, lifting her onto his lap and noting how she'd grown in just a few months since the custody hearing. "How was school today?" "Amazing!" Sophie launched into a detailed account of her day, the art project she'd completed, the spelling test she'd aced, the friend who'd invited her to a birthday party. Julian listened with the focused attention he'd once reserved for million-dollar deals, understanding that these small victories in Sophie's life were far more important than any business achievement. "Mr. Cross." His assistant appeared in the doorway again. "The Morrison Group is here for your 4 p.m. meeting." Julian looked at Sophie, then at his calendar, then made a decision that would have shocked the Julian Cross of a year ago. "Reschedule it," he said. "My daughter and I have important plans." "We do?" Sophie asked, perking up with interest. "We do," Julian confirmed. "Ice cream plans. And maybe a trip to that bookstore you've been wanting to visit." As they left Cross Technologies together, Sophie's small hand confidently in his, her chatter filling the elevator with life, Julian realized he'd finally learned to prioritize what actually mattered. June 15, 2025, Sophie's elementary school. The school auditorium was packed with parents wielding cameras and phones, all focused on the small stage where Sophie's second-grade class was performing their end-of-year program. Julian sat in the front row, having arrived 30 minutes early to secure the best possible view of his daughter's theatrical debut. When Sophie appeared on stage wearing a costume she'd helped design, a butterfly with wings that sparkled under the stage lights, Julian felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he was struck by how far they'd both traveled. "That's my daddy," Sophie announced to the audience during her solo moment, pointing directly at Julian with the confidence of someone completely secure in being claimed and celebrated. "He saved me, and I saved him, and now we're a family forever." The audience laughed and applauded, but Julian was too busy wiping tears from his eyes to care about the attention. After the performance, as parents milled around congratulating their children, Julian found himself approached by other fathers who wanted to share their own stories of unexpected fatherhood, of love that had surprised them with its intensity. "You're lucky," one father said, watching Sophie demonstrate her butterfly dance to a group of admiring classmates. "She's an amazing kid." "I know," Julian replied, meaning it completely. "I'm the luckiest man alive." September 1st, 2025, Sophie's new school. The transition to third grade brought new challenges and opportunities. Sophie had tested into the gifted program at her school, her academic abilities blossoming under the stability and encouragement Julian provided. But it was her emotional growth that amazed him most, the way she'd learned to trust, to hope, to believe that good things could last. "Daddy," Sophie said one evening as they worked on homework together in what had become their routine, "I wrote something at school today that I want to share with you." She pulled out a composition notebook and cleared her throat with theatrical seriousness before reading. "My Family" by Sophie Cross. "A year ago, I didn't have a real family. I had a mama who tried to love me but couldn't take care of me, and I was scared and hungry a lot. Then one night when I was very cold and didn't know what to do, my daddy found me. He didn't know he was going to be my daddy yet, but I think his heart knew, because he took care of me like daddies are supposed to do. Now I have a daddy who makes me feel safe and loved every day. He comes to my school plays and helps with homework and reads me stories and never makes me feel like I'm too much trouble. We're not the same kind of family as some people because he didn't know me when I was a baby, but we chose each other and that makes us special." The end. Julian was quiet for a long moment after Sophie finished reading, overwhelmed by her ability to articulate what he'd struggled to understand himself. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said finally. "And you're absolutely right. We are special. Do you want to know a secret?" Sophie asked, climbing into his lap with the easy affection that had become natural between them. "Always. I used to wish on stars for a daddy who would love me and never leave me. And then you found me, so I know wishes can come true if you believe in them hard enough." December 24th, 2025, Cross Family Home. Christmas Eve found Julian and Sophie in the kitchen of the house they'd moved to 6 months earlier, a place that felt more like home than any space Julian had ever inhabited. It was smaller than his penthouse, warmer, filled with Sophie's artwork and photographs of their adventures together. They were making cookies for Santa with the kind of serious dedication that only an 8-year-old could bring to the task. Sophie wore the apron Julian had bought her, bright purple with Chef Sophie embroidered across the front, and had flour in her hair and frosting on her nose. "Daddy," Sophie said as they waited for the latest batch to bake, "I want to tell you something important." "What's that, princess?" "I know you were sad before you found me, because your first little girl went to heaven. And I want you to know that I'm not trying to replace her, because I know she was special and you'll always love her." Julian felt his breath catch at Sophie's intuitive understanding of the complexity of his heart. "But I also want you to know," Sophie continued, "that loving me doesn't mean you love her less. Hearts get bigger when they love more people, they don't get smaller." Julian knelt down to Sophie's level, looking into eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "How did you get so smart?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me," Sophie said simply. "You taught me that love isn't something you run out of. It's something that grows when you share it." As they finished decorating cookies and hung stockings by the fireplace, Julian reflected on the year that had transformed them both. Sophie had taught him that healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant making room for new love alongside old memories. She'd shown him that the heart's capacity for joy was infinite, that second chances were real, and that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that chose each other. "Daddy," Sophie said as he tucked her into bed that Christmas Eve, "do you think Mama Maria is okay?" Julian considered the question carefully. They'd received updates through social services. Maria was in a long-term rehabilitation program and had been clean for 8 months. She sent cards on Sophie's birthday and holidays, and someday, when she was ready, there might be a place for supervised visits. "I think your mama is working very hard to get better," Julian said honestly. "And I think she loves you very much, even though she couldn't take care of you the way you needed." "I hope she gets better," Sophie said. "And I hope someday she can meet you and see how happy we are together." "Me too, sweetheart." As Julian turned off Sophie's light and closed her bedroom door, he walked through their home and marveled at how completely his life had been transformed. The lonely CEO who'd found a collapsing child at a bus stop had become a father, a family man, someone whose greatest achievements had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Cross. The Peterson acquisition closed successfully. You're officially Seattle's most successful CEO under 40. Julian read the message and felt nothing but mild satisfaction. The real victory was upstairs sleeping peacefully, dreaming of sugar cookies and Santa Claus and all the Christmases they'd share together. Julian Cross had learned the most important lesson of his life. Success wasn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the trust of a little girl who called him Daddy, in the laughter that filled their home, and in the knowledge that he'd chosen love over loneliness and found his greatest treasure in the process. On Christmas morning, as Sophie squealed with delight over the presents under their tree, Julian understood that he'd received the greatest gift of all. A daughter who'd taught him that the strongest families weren't born. They were forged in the crucible of choice, commitment, and the daily decision to love someone more than yourself. Have you ever found your greatest purpose in the most unexpected place? What would you do if you had the chance to change a child's life forever? Share your thoughts below. And if this story reminded you that the most beautiful families are often the ones we choose, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe that second chances and unexpected love can heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes the family you need finds you exactly when you're ready to love again.